Irene was born in 1927, right into one of the most horrifying and appalling events in history, the Holocaust. In 1933, a man named Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, adopting the power that came along with that position. Hitler had many opinionated ideas and values, including his most famous, the final solution. The origin of this plan was to exterminate the Jewish people, and it was implemented in stages. After the Nazi Party rose to power, discrimination enforced by the state resulted in anti-Jewish legislation and Aryanization. A large portion of the non-Aryan population was Jewish, and soon the Jews were being removed from society. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and World War II formally began. The things that happened to Jews after the invasion of Poland were terrible, and Irene lived through it all to tell her story. Irene was an only child born in Krakow, Poland, to a mixed family with many intermarriages, a combination of Catholics and Jews. She celebrated Jewish holidays with her grandfather and Catholic holidays with her aunt. Irene's father was an optometrist, and she was a privileged child who attended a private Catholic school. They went on many vacations, from skiing in Poland to trips to the Baltic Sea. Irene's mother died in 1938, and she was left with only her nurturing father. In 1939, she began to hear talk of war with Germany. Her schoolteacher reassured students that the Germans were unprepared and technologically behind, and that the Polish army would be able to repel them if they ever invaded. She was wrong. In the summer of 1939, Irene attended a summer camp for a few weeks because her dad was doing well enough to afford it. In early September, the camp was cut short because there was more and more talk of war with Germany. When Irene's dad came to pick her up, the train station was hectic and people were running around everywhere. Once they got home, they were prepared with gas masks in case of poison. Irene even made a small gas mask for their little dog. Luckily, they never had a reason to use them. One day, they heard an air raid siren warning of imminent bombing, and this was Irene's introduction into the war. She lived with her dad in a 3-story apartment building, and they were able to hear explosions all around them of houses being destroyed. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, was hit the worst, completely obliterated by the bombs. Loudspeakers came on, warning everyone to remain in their homes and to not look out the windows. The Germans were coming, and Poland was taken over within 2 weeks with little resistance. At that point, Irene saw that her teacher was wrong. The Germans had tanks, helmets, and more resources that were all in good condition. The Germans pointed rifles at the windows in case of snipers, and they even formed a German government that took over the city hall. Soon, the Germans began to give directives to the Polish people. The first one was a curfew, and the citizens could not be out of their houses during certain hours. Irene's father's store had been closed for a few days when the Germans took over, but soon he was called back for work. He was able to open his store, but he could only fill the glasses prescriptions for Germans and was not allowed to serve the public. To Irene, this lasted for what seemed like weeks. A body of Jewish men was created called the Judenrat in order to administer and enforce German directives directly to the Jews. With the final solution in mind, they had to do whatever Hitler and the Germans had in store, including enforcing hard work and fulfilling a quota for shooting to start exterminating Jews. The second directive that the Germans enacted was to separate Jews from the Christian and Catholic Poles. Soon, Irene and her father were separated from their Christian neighbors and forced to wear white armbands with a blue Jewish star on them. There was an influx of Jews into Krakow and the separated area of the city because the Nazis thought that they would be easier to control if they were all in one area. They were only allowed to bring what they could carry, which meant that a lot of furniture was left behind. In the new living quarters, food was almost always scarce, but there was no ration system, so either they found some food or they didn't eat it at all. Irene recalled one day when her dad brought home an entire ham, and she was so hungry that she wanted to eat the entire thing before it was ready. Not long after moving into the separated Jewish living quarters, people were moved to a more formal ghetto, which was walled in and gated, and all of the Jews were given identification cards upon arrival. Then Irene felt a temporary sense of relief.
But they're all Jews there, walled in, very concentrated, and well organized. And for a while, the organization gave me a sense of peace. By peace, I mean my father was able to open his store and dispense glasses to the ghetto population.
In the ghetto, there was a town square used for roll calls that served as selections for transport to another camp. Soon, Irene began to notice that the trucks were coming back within just 1 hour, and many Jews in the ghetto began to realize that these selected people weren't actually going to a different camp. They were being taken into the forests and killed. In the ghetto, Irene heard rumors of being moved to yet another location south of the Vistula River, to an extermination camp called Plaszow. People in the ghetto either went by truck or by foot to the new camp, and they were only allowed to bring one suitcase, but they ended up losing most of these belongings as well. This new camp was surrounded by barbed wire and had latrines and barracks in rows that held bunk beds, each for 3 or 4 people. In these barracks, men and women were separated, but Irene was still able to see her father on a daily basis. The daily roll call was continued here, and if the Nazis didn't like the way people looked or acted, they would shoot them on the spot. While in this camp, most of the men were taken outside to do labor such as sweeping the streets or cleaning the factories, and Irene's father was one of them. If these men did not march in unison and on beat, they would be shot. Irene also had a job in the camp. However, she was working in a less demanding job assembling military packages of wool socks and gloves alongside many other women. Even though people had jobs in the camps, selections still took place on a daily basis. Irene recalled one memory specifically when a German policeman came into the barrack where she worked. He split the women up on different sides of the room. One side was headed for life, the other for death. Irene was told to go to one side, and luckily for her, that side ended up being the people who lived. Food at Plaszow was scarce and given in rations, and Irene remembers that her dad would always share his with her. Meals usually consisted of some bread in the mornings and evenings, an occasional coffee, and soup at night that tasted like dishwater. One day, Irene's dad came to her with some news.
My father came to me, and he wasn't looking well by then. I was quite worried about him. He didn't have adequate food. He was tired. He was all of like about 42. He came to me and said that he was able to get reassigned to a smaller camp, which was supposedly better than the one we were at. By better, I mean there was more food, there was less killing, there was more humanity. And as soon as he got established, he would send for me. Well, that was never to be. He left the next day, and I never saw him again. That was the worst part of my life. But I have to tell you that after he left, I felt a sense of relief and a guilt at that relief. I thought he wouldn't suffer, but deep down I knew there was no such thing as a good camp.
Soon, Plaszow was evacuated and the inmates were transported in sections to a different concentration camp. On the journey to Auschwitz, large numbers of people were squashed into small cattle cars that had few windows, and they were given no food or water. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, another very large selection took place. The weak, ill, elderly, and young children were put on one side, and the healthy, including Irene, were put on the other. After the selection, everyone was forced to undress and hand in any personal belongings before going to the showers. Because people were being killed in gas chambers at Auschwitz, Irene and the other Jews were in constant fear, not knowing if they were going to be taking showers or if they were going to be gassed. Once in the showers, the suspense only continued as the water was delayed and they never knew what was going to come out. After exiting the showers, Irene's personal belongings were never returned to her, and everyone at the camp was issued blue and white striped uniforms.
Anyway, we were issued those uniforms, and the next day we were lined up outside. It was a beautiful sunny day. We were being tattooed, our arms were being tattooed, we were assigned numbers. From then on, we were numbers, numbers on our arms. And my number was A25 to 36.
Irene was placed in a small camp within Auschwitz that was physically nicer than the other barracks, and the people there worked to prepare German uniforms. One day, Irene had a toothache, so she went to the hospital in Auschwitz, and a German dentist filled her tooth. Irene did not know this at the time, but that hospital was an experimental medical hospital and the Germans used it to study things like identical twins and if they react the same to different tests. Here, many other horrible tests and experimental procedures were run on unanesthetized people. After a few months, the people at Auschwitz were evacuated to Bergen-Belsen, and the journey here is known as the Death March of 1944. They walked through snow and mud in the middle of the winter, past many Poles and Germans who stood by and merely watched. This made Irene feel embarrassed and like an animal. If anyone lagged behind the rest of the group, they were shot on the spot, and others couldn't do anything to help them unless they wanted to die along with them. At Bergen-Belsen, there was no systematic killing or gas chambers, but there were still daily roll calls and deaths. Here, the only food available was what they were able to scrounge off the ground, and the people lived in constant and intense starvation. Along with the scarcity of food, there were no bunk beds, and people were forced to sleep on the cold, hard floors. One day, Irene felt ill. She was too sick to even feel the hunger and starvation, and soon she was diagnosed by a fellow inmate as having typhus. Irene was transported to a hospital and placed in a bunk bed with many others, and eventually the typhus spread all throughout the camp. From the hospital window, Irene could see a pile of corpses so deformed and unreal that they hardly looked like people. Finally, on April 15, 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated. On that day, a white sheet appeared on the outside of a barrack as a sign of surrender, and there was no roll call that morning, nor were there any Germans to be seen. British tanks rolled into the camp to liberate Bergen-Belsen. Although the army did not have paramedics on board, they still handed out the military rations of concentrated food like chocolate that they had with them. Many of the camp inmates' bodies were not prepared for those kinds of foods, and these people died of dysentery as a result. This day marked the end of the war for Irene. After liberation, Irene lived in the British zone of Germany, cooking and cleaning for British officers. She eventually smuggled herself and a few friends into the American zone and then into Austria, where they worked for the American Intelligence Office. Later, Irene lived in London for a while and worked as a nurse's aide in a hospital. One of her mother's relatives was a surgeon, and he asked everyone if they had heard of Irene, but her father was much more well known than she was. Eventually, this cousin was able to find Irene, and he helped her come to the United States on a student visa. In 1948, Irene traveled on the SS America to the United States. She eventually married Edward Seelig, an American, and had a family with him, a remarkable ending to such an incredible story.